My name is Charles Epting, and you're listening to the Lost Labels podcast. When you think about Stiff Records, I think one of the first things, or maybe the first thing that comes to mind, is their marketing, is their promotion, is their publicity, which was oftentimes very radical, very unprecedented, very unorthodox, and really, I think, revolutionized the music industry. So today it's really exciting that we're going to be talking to one of the main forces behind that unconventional publicity. We're going to be talking to Andy Murray, who was the press officer at Stiff Records. He was an actual employee of the label. He joined in 1978, so a little bit after the label was founded, but certainly very early on. And he was there through the end of 1979, thereabouts. And I'm really excited to have this opportunity to speak to him because, again, Stiff Records is nothing. The music's great, but they're nothing if not their promotions and marketing. And I think to be able to hear the inside story on some of that is a really exciting opportunity. The other thing I'm really excited to talk to Andy about is the fact that he was in a group called the Stiff All-Stars, which is a very strangely named band when you consider that none of their music was ever released on Stiff Records. So the Stiff All-Stars also included Nigel Dick, the famed music video director. They released 2 singles, the first of which, Maybe Tonight, came out on Chiswick Records in 1980. The second, You Tell Me Lies, was self-released in 1981. And amazingly enough, they actually released a full-length CD in 2010. They got back together and filled out an entire CD's worth of material, which I've got a copy of and is great listening. So between his work in the press office at Stiff Records and, again, I want to learn more about the Stiff All-Stars, I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Andy Murray. Andy, to start things off, what was your official job title at Stiff Records?
Well, I never had a title. I started as the guy who organized the tour that went by train. So the B-Stiff tour, Dave had this idea of renting a train to get publicity, which it did. And they needed somebody to organize it, to book the train, essentially. And my background, I knew Paul Conroy from college. I was a college booker, or social secretary, as they call them. So I knew I used to book bands off him. And then when I moved to London, I finished my degree in graphic design. I was an agent, and I was a terrible agent, such a terrible agent, I quit after 6 months. So I was on unemployment for a couple of weeks. And I walked into Virgin Records in Marble Arch, and I knew the guy behind the counter, who was Dave Bates, who subsequently became an A&R man at Phonogram and signed Def Leppard and et cetera, Tears for Fears. And then I ended up working with him again then, but not because of him, because of other things. Anyway, so I got a job working behind the counter, and then I was promoted to assistant manager of Virgin Records Brighton, then manager of Virgin Records Croydon. Now, punk in the UK started in 1976 with the Sex Pistols, but just prior to that was Stiff. So when I was working behind the counter selling singles and cassettes, in came, it would have been Jake, I suppose, might have been Paul Conroy, but I don't think it was Paul because I knew Paul. But anyway, somebody came in and gave us a little leaflet, and I kicked myself for not keeping it. And that told us all about Stiff Records and Buy One, which was So It Goes, Heart of the City. So we knew about Stiff, and we stocked the singles, and we sold lots of them, et cetera, et cetera. So then 2 years later, I got a call when I was in Croydon, and we were selling, obviously, Sex Pistols, had a big display for Anarchy in the UK and the album and everything, never mind the bollocks. And we also, Croydon was the home of Johnny Moped, so the members of Johnny Moped would come in and buy singles or harass us or whatever. Anyway, I got a phone call from these friends of mine who ran a college newspaper for promoters called Circuit Magazine. And the husband worked for Music Week, the trade paper, and the wife was pregnant with their first child, and they needed to have some more time off, so they needed a new editor. So I became the editor, working with Hillary, and then she had term off to have the child, and it was just me on my own. So I was editing this magazine and dealing with agents and promoters, mostly college promoters. So Paul Conroy, who was by then the general manager at Stiff, thought, rightly or wrongly, that I would certainly know how to deal with agents and how to deal with local promoters, and probably would know a little bit about local promotion. So he basically talked Dave Robinson into giving me a job as the tour coordinator. Now, at the time, they didn't have a press officer. There was nobody literally in the press office. There wasn't a press office. There was a basement. And so I had to get together all the corporate press. So I duplicated the photos, wrote the press releases, sent them out, dealt with the trade press, launched the tour, and then in the course of the tour did regional press, not so much radio, but just before the tour started, they hired a radio promotion person called Sunny Ray, who was fantastically good, and she and I shared an office. And so she did local but mostly national radio, and I did regional press and trade press. Music. There were 3 trade papers at the time, and then when the tour stopped, I just sort of got kept on. I became the press office because there wasn't anyone else to do it, and I knew Pete Frame, who you would know of, was a fantastic guy who's written an amazing book about pop music in Britain in the 50s. And he had gone off to do independent PR and also had edited Zigzag. So I knew him slightly, and I also knew, for whatever reason, Glenn Coulson, who was a sort of independent PR. And then Cosmo Vinyl came in particularly to do Ian Dury. He was Ian Dury's sort of loudmouth frontman. So I did the music press except for Ian Dury, whose press was done by Cosmo Vinyl. So I then taught myself to be a press officer, essentially. So I always tell people I was head of press, but really I was press. I was the person doing it.
I think the 1978 B Stiff Tour is very interesting because there's so much lore and fascination with the 1977 Stiff Tour. It seems to me like the B Stiff Tour was almost like trying to catch lightning in a bottle twice. Is that a fair representation of the tour?
Yes, kind of, yes. I mean, you would never do it. You also have to backtrack a little bit and say the music business in 1978, which is when I started. Stiff started in 76, and I came in June 78, some round about then. And of course, Elvis and Nick had gone off to form Radar with Jake. And Jake had decided to be a manager and much less of a record guy. And obviously Jake and Dave Robinson were a very good team because Jake was very much a sort of loud, brash ideas guy, in your face, very good with the music papers. And Dave was plainly far more of a guy who made the records. And he had had a little studio above the Hope and Anchor pub in North London and had recorded people and sort of taught himself record production. So Jake was much more of a sort of conceptual guy and a slogans guy, and Dave was more actually the nuts and bolts of running a record label. That was much more what he was interested in. Now, in the interim, given that the rest of the world was unbelievably stodgy, and there were independents, but really there wasn't and there were punk independents, obviously, who put out 5 records and sold 500 copies and whatever. But Stiff was very much a label that punched above its weight in terms of attitude and slogans and graphics. And that was a lot to do with Chris Morton, the in-house art guy, who was a fantastic guy, and also Barney Bubbles, who's an absolutely influential British design genius. So the whole package of attitude, but also sounds and pictures, and the idea of selling your merchandising and, making money out of a T-shirt that said, "If it ain't stiff, it ain't worth a fuck." That was all stuff that was light years ahead of all the other record labels, who really were just used to putting out singles. And in the 70s, certainly, it was pretty much, up until 1974, it was mostly a singles market in Britain. The albums didn't sell terribly well till the mid-70s to the late 70s. But even in 1978, a platinum album was unheard of. A gold album did pretty well, which is 100,000 copies. So your record labels are mostly making money out of selling 500,000 singles, and they didn't spend any money on them other than paying for radio producers' lunches and dinners and having parties. And when I worked at Circuit Magazine, I used to go to 4 launches a day. The reason I knew journalists, funny enough, that's how they thought I could get some press for them, is because I went to all these launches. And the people would just be launching a new single or a new album or whatever. But they wouldn't spend very much money on marketing them. Marketing was it was an advert in the music papers is what it was. And Stiff also revolutionized an attitude to getting records out there. And we made some mistakes, but we did lots of bold things. and weren't afraid to do kind of silly things for the basis of getting the artist's name around. And mostly the rest of the labels were somnolent. So Dave is not British, Dave is Irish, and had a real pioneering spirit. He had this real attitude, correctly, as it turned out, that your major labels were half asleep, and that we, in this case Stiff, were going to be twice as speedy on everything, which pretty much we were. We were all working at 100% all the time, 6 days a week, if not 7. In fact, I used to go in on the 7th day, because I lived around the corner, to do the mail-outs, because it was the only time I had to put the labels on the review copies, to put them in the post the next day.
The 5 players on the B Stiff tour was Lene Lovich, Mickey Jupp, Jona Lewie, Wreckless Eric, and Rachel Sweet. 5 very eclectic, diverse, all very talented, but each certainly very unique and not really a cohesive group. What was it like for you to have to promote that lineup? It's a very again, eclectic is the word I keep coming back to. All 5 artists each have a very distinctive sound.
Well, it was easy in one sense in terms of going to the music papers, because they knew who Stiff were, and we had some journalists like Alan Jones, who was very pro-Stiff and liked the artists. It was a bit, as we would say in English, arse about face, because contrary to what I've just said, the records kind of came second. It was we had the artists. Now, bear in mind, I didn't sign these artists, so I can't take any credit for or blame for them being on the label. But they weren't as disparate as you would imagine, because in those days, in the early days of punk, people were far more broad-minded than they are today, and possibly that since you're an American, you're used to the sort of vertical streaming of the American record market, which says, well, if you like country, you can't like blues. If you like R&B, you can't like folk. If you like, this kind of music, there's a radio station for it. Well, in Europe, and particularly in Britain, it's more lateral. The top 40, yes, but you would tend to get musical play, national play as well, on stuff that was an interesting record, rather than the nature of the artist who produced it, if you see what I mean. Now, given that Stiff wasn't intended entirely to be a hit machine, although Dave realized after a couple of years that actually if you didn't have hits, it was very hard to pay the bills. But at that stage, it wasn't really about hits. It was about saving the label, because having spent a lot of effort on breaking Elvis and Nick, they were the label initially. And Ian Dury was an oddball who came to Stiff via Charlie Gillett, who had his own little label, his production company called Oval. And Ian, of course, had been the leading light of Kilburn and the High Road. So again, very oddball, disparate team. But Ian Dury and the Blockheads were a far more sort of driving, rock-based, soul rock, let's say, artist. And when I joined the label, they had just had a hit with What a Waste, which I think had gone top 10. So suddenly, sort of Stiff was on the map, and there was the chance of having a roster of artists who might actually do quite well. So in that sort of second wave, if you like, after Ian, who was the leading light of the label, and in '79 went on to have a million-selling single with Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick. In the interim, Dave had sort of collected this group of artists. So you had, and all of them would have been known to people who were interested in music. Lene Lovich again came through Charlie Gillett. He had discovered her doing recordings of various types, so he was involved with her. Mickey Jupp was very well regarded on the, if I say pub rock, it's a bit unfair, because he really was a blues rocker, very sort of New Orleans influenced Americana, but a great gravelly singer-songwriter, slightly older than the rest of the artists, but very well regarded, and certainly as a songwriter. So you've got somebody who could make records and write songs. You've got Jona Lewie, who had a hit with Pterodactyl and the Dinosaurs, and was very sort of boogie-woogie oriented. That was his thing. Eric, of course, was on the label, another sort of left field, but really in the singer-songwriter rock genre. And then Rachel Sweet came from the Akron Compilation. Were you cognizant of that?
Yeah, so the Akron scene is another that I'm fascinated with, and I've been lucky enough to talk to a couple of the key players in that scene. There was some really great music coming out of there at that time.
I know, and who would have thought it? You know, the fact there was a scene at all. I mean, you know, Akron's about the same as my hometown in Scotland. You know, it's not somewhere anyone would mention as somewhere to come from.
That Stiff compilation is a great historical document for that scene.
Now, there's a couple of things that I try and mention to people, because your average person who isn't in the music business think that either there's loads of money washing around or that it's easy, and neither is true, and certainly wasn't true then. Recording costs were expensive. If we end up talking about the Stiff All-Stars, I could talk to you about that, but a day in a recording studio was about £300, which is more like £3,000 these days, if not more. So recording costs were, you couldn't just walk in off the street and make a record, because it cost too much money. And the whole argument, the punk ethos was that you could do it very quickly and live in a cheap studio in North London or the north of England, which is true. If you got yourself together and rehearsed, or perhaps you didn't rehearse, but you just did 2 takes and didn't spend much money on the mix and pressed up some singles yourself, and that's fine. There was a sort of do-it-yourself ethos. But if you wanted to have, if I say hit records, I mean records that have impact. Doesn't necessarily need to be a hit as such, but something that got reviewed in the papers and, you know, got some airplay and, you know, made an impact. If you were the Inmates or, you know, who should we say, the Skids, you know, somebody you wanted to actually have a career. It wasn't just about making records in your bedroom. Well, it still costs some money, you know, it does, and more money than you would have had. So you need somebody to give you that money. So in terms of Stiff, you've got 2 things. One is you need the artists. Where are you going to get the artists? Well, I've just mentioned that, you know, you have your feelers out, but also if you're a singles label, Jane Eyre being an example, you put somebody in the studio with a tested producer, which is why Nick Lowe did all those early productions, because he, you know, could get results from people. He was very vibey, he knew how to work quickly, and also Stiff used a lot. What the hell's it called? A studio in North London that was tiny, where they got great results. Go on, I'm going senile. Barry Farmer, Bazza, was the resident engineer. Anyway, sadly, I never got to go there. My friend Nigel Dick was the messenger at the time. He got to go there to ferry people in and out. But I'd love to make some recordings there. It'll come to me, and you'll have it in the Stiff biography. Anyway, whatever it was called. So you needed affordable studios, or you cut a deal with Ian Jury, for instance, made his record at Manfred Mann's studio at the Workhouse, which Manfred Mann co-owned, and the managers, I think, co-owned it or had some deal. So you could get master recordings where you weren't like a big label constantly giving big advances to people who would then spend 6 months making the record that you couldn't sell. You couldn't afford to do that. You had to have throughput of artists and recordings. So if you are in a situation where you've got a name and you've got some talent, like, let's say, Jane Eyre, well, you can put a single out and you see what happens. Oh, great, single of the week, right. Then you might decide to make an album if you had someone to write songs and produce it. Now, Jane Eyre, of course, went off to Virgin, and she was very nice. I liked her a lot. So she also was before my time. I met her because we had a lot in common with Virgin and Dintis, because they were just around the corner. So I knew a lot of the staff, so we'd meet some of the artists and whatever. And going back to Rachel Sweet, she had a connection with Liam Sternberg, who was a writer-producer. So if you've got the 5 artists on the Be Stiff tour, what was set up with them is that they were all in a position to go into the studio and make recordings. And what was good about Dave as a label boss is that he was very involved in those recordings. So I was looking up some of the comments I'd made in there's another Stiff book, and I went back to my comments. Then I made the point about the writer had made a thing about Mickey Jupp's album, Japanese, where he had stated that Nick Lowe had made one part of the album, and then and Dave had said, no, I want Gary Brooker to do some ballads, whatever. Actually, it was the other way around. Mickey Jupp, being from Southend, had tracks produced by Gary Brooker from Procol Harum in a studio in Worthing, and gave them into Dave, and Dave said, well, yeah, okay, these are good, but the thing is, Mickey, you're a rocker. Where's the rocking tracks? So he called up Nick Lowe and said, get Rockpile down to Worthing and make half an album with Mickey Jupp. And what about these other songs that you weren't going to record, like Switchboard Susan and You'll Never Get Me Up in one of those? So that's what Mickey recorded. So Dave was very hands-on in terms of the label. And if he didn't think that something was good enough for the artist, shall we say, he would say so. And since he was paying the bill, he had every right to say so, in my opinion. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying that the artists weren't quite as disparate as you think. It worked very well on the tour because they complemented each other, and then everybody got on at the end and did Be Stiff. They weren't as rocking as the 1977 tour, and it certainly was probably true at the time that the kind of people who went to Friday and Saturday night gigs were predominantly male in Britain. They were people who read the music papers, wore jeans, might or might not have had a leather jacket, weren't necessarily punks, but would go to standing-only venues, drink lots of beer, sing along, shout, and have a good time. So that wasn't necessarily the kind of people who would keep quiet during somebody singing ballads. So that was more probably in tune with the 77 tour, which was more electric guitar oriented, should we say. But the Be Stiff tour was a great tour. I mean, musically, it was fantastically good.
I think it's particularly interesting that Rachel Sweet had the records as her backing band.
Well, the story there is because she didn't have a band. She'd made a record mostly with Liam Sternberg recording all the tracks. He did a lot of overdubbing. And a very quirky record it was. Again, Dave got the tracks and he said, well, this is all very well, Liam, but I need tracks. I need songs that are going to get on the radio. So he put a call into the Blockheads and said, right, I need you to do 4 tracks. One of which was B-A-B-Y Baby, which was the only song that we really got any kind of traction with from those tour albums. And it was all done very quickly, the whole thing. If you'd planned it better, you probably would have taken those 5 albums and you said, okay, right, now I need some singles, I need some hits, I want to do some remixes. There was never any time for any of that. It was, it was tour starts in October, and even then it went back. It was going to start in September, I think, originally. We put it back to, I think, October the 10th to November the 19th. So I think we put it back a month because the records weren't ready. And then had to release all the records at once in the first week, and off you go. So it was a tremendous push with no time at all. But anyway, so Dave said, look, the record isn't finished. I need these radio-friendly tracks, which he got the Blockheads to play on. So, of course, she didn't have a band. So Dave, like everybody did then and now, they ask everybody around, who do you know? What musicians do you know? Well, the trouble is that people tend to know musicians who have played on records. And there are kinds of musicians who play on records who tend to be experienced, which also means they're probably not 18. So Liam assembled a band of people who were not 18. And Dave said, well, this is never going to fly. So we knew the records because Paul Conroy used to manage the Kersal Flyers, and the drummer in the Kersal Flyers was Will Birch, who's a songwriter and lyricist, and he had formed the records. And I'm trying to remember the chronology. It must have been later. Yes, it was later because I ended up sharing a flat with Hugh Gower from the records, but that was after that. At the time I was working at Stiff, I was sharing a flat with Paul Loseby, and I ended up sharing a flat with Rachel Sweet because we had a spare room in our flat, and we were living in Moscow Road round the corner. Anyway, so basically, we knew that the records were gigging. We knew them. We went to see them. They were on the circuit. They were a ready-made entity, and we said, or Dave, of course, it would have been said, look, do you fancy backing Rachel Sweet? And we'll let you do some songs of your own, and this will put your, this tour is going to be publicized up the yin-yang, which it was. You're probably not worth an awful lot in terms of headlining gigs, so this is going to give you a 6-week tour, after which everyone will have seen you. How good is that? And they went, yeah, good. And it worked out very well.
There was a lot of marketing that went along with the Be Stiff tour. All 5 artists released new albums on the same day. I know there was colored vinyl, there were picture discs. How much of a hand did you have in that side of things?
Well, I wasn't doing marketing. One of the reasons I got into marketing is I could see that Paul and Alan, to a lesser extent, because Alan did mostly international, but they came up with their ideas themselves. They were doing lots of fun things, and I was much less involved with it. My friend Nigel, was upstairs sitting next door to Paul doing production by that time. He'd moved from being the messenger and driver to being head of production. So he was doing all the production stuff. So Paul Conroy was doing a lot of the sort of fun ideas. And the label and various labels had been doing colored vinyl singles. And one of the first things I had to work on was... it would have been later, but I think Just Water had been a clear vinyl single. Anyway, there was such a thing as colored vinyl. And Dave and Paul probably decided, and certainly Dave, Paul, and Alan decided they were going to do picture discs. So this was going to be the big thing. And they were going to do colored vinyl. Each of them was going to have colored vinyls. That was fairly easy. And we managed to ship 10,000 copies of each of them, which was, a hefty commitment to the marketplace and to sales. That was our big gimmick, that we were going to do colored vinyls and picture discs. And then we reverted to black vinyl, such that the black vinyl versions of those albums are actually rarer than the colored vinyl versions. Because we did something like 8,000 of each one in a color and 2,000 picture discs, and then after that, black vinyl. And that was the basis on which I then presented the whole thing as a marketing campaign and won it as the marketing campaign of the year with both Music Week, Trade Bible, and the NME against people like Polydor, who, would you believe, entered Grease and Saturday Night Fever as one campaign. What? What do you mean? And quite rightly, the judges went, yeah, get on your bike. But they changed our award, the Stiff Award, to Top Promotion of the Year, because I gave them all the blarney I'm giving you now for half an hour, and I showed them all the passes we did, and the patches, and the adverts, and the posters, and the promotional stuff, and all that. And they were, oh, this is amazing, this is incredible. Then they said, well, how many did you sell? And I'd say, well, 12,000 of each. What? So they changed it to Top Promotion of the Year, which is an award I think they've never awarded since. But the NME gave us top marketing. It was the marketing award for the NME. We certainly won that. Except Dave nicked the plaque. I never got to keep the plaque. But it was me who presented it, who did the spiel.
After the Be Stiff tour, what was the rest of your time at Stiff Records like?
I was only there another year, and I learned an awful lot in that year. But at the beginning, it would have been the beginning of the end of 79. I saw that it was, again, I've described this in other books. What was happening was that I managed to get good at doing press to the extent that I could, not that I could achieve anything particularly, because what you were there for is to serve the artist to make sure that they could be reviewed, would be interviewed, the photos were serviced. You can't create coverage if there isn't anything to write about. And I would do things like I got to launch Stiff Records in Portugal with Eric. So we went out there for 2 days and went out on a boat round the bay where the booze ran out after half an hour. But we were with Alan Jones from Melody Maker, who wrote it up in a highly amusing piece for Melody Maker, making us out to being, as we were, somewhat eccentric. And just sort of rather questioning the validity of the whole exercise. But it was highly entertaining. But basically what happened was I would call people up and say, well, I want you to write about, our artist or our new artist, or let's say Kirsty MacColl, who was lovely. I used to go down and see her. I did her first single, which was They Don't Know, which wasn't a hit, but was subsequently a hit for Tracy Ullman. And she was working in the Department of Social Security, in other words, the unemployment office in Croydon. So I took journalists down to see her in her lunch break. And she was very nice and very entertaining. And obviously, I saw her later when she became a big artist, and she didn't change. She was extremely nice and very talented, and a big loss. But what would happen is, the point of the story being, I would call up journalists and they would go, "Oh yeah, you're just paid to say that." And I'd say, "Well, yeah, I am paid to say it, but the point is, I believe it. And, I want you to at least listen." No. They were all so relentlessly cynical that I found it too depressing. So I resolved to get into marketing and have a little bit more say over, what you could achieve, rather than be at the mercy of a whole phalanx of cynical journalists. So there you go. So that's why I wasn't there very long.
Now, you were in a band called the Stiff All-Stars, which has raised a lot of questions for me. Perhaps most notably the fact that you guys never released any music on Stiff. Can you talk a little bit about what that project was, though? Who were the Stiff All-Stars, and what was the concept behind it? Because again, it's been really perplexing for me to try to figure out.
Yes, well, much derided. There was a phrase then and probably now, which is frustrated musician at record labels, where if you did anything musical, you were sneered at by other people at the record label, because you weren't meant to do that. Musicians were either artists. I mean, I got told off by Chalky Davis, the photographer, the day before. I was up working at Phonogram and we were seeing Thin Lizzy, and I said, "Oh, I've got to get up early tomorrow because I'm doing some recording." "You shouldn't be recording. Recording's for artists. It's not for the likes of you." I thought, "Oh, who are you?" What do you mean? I can't, I'm not allowed to write songs or play the guitar? Beat it. Anyway, there was this very snobby attitude in the 70s, certainly, notwithstanding punk, that artists were a breed apart and you had to be a bit special, which, fair enough, it's a sort of self-adjusting quality meter, if you like. But what happened was Dave Robinson got married. He was in Australia touring with Graham Parker and the Rumour, who he managed, even though they were signed to Phonogram and then subsequently Stiff and Arista. And so while he was away for about a month, so we said, well, let's do various things. We recorded a record for him, which he didn't like at all, which I recorded with Glenn Coulson interviewing people and edited it all together, and he demanded we recall all the copies because he wasn't happy with it at all. But anyway, for whatever reason, he wanted to have a party. And the good venue in London at the time, subsequently knocked down, was the Clarendon Ballroom, which was really an upstairs room in a pub with a little stage and a long sort of bar. And that was where there were lots of gigs, punk gigs and our artist gigs, and you could hire the place. So we hired it on a Saturday night, and we were going to have the Inmates, who, as I say, I think they were on Radar, in fact, having been on, I think they'd had a single on Chiswick, maybe. But anyway, they were on Radar. They were top in the bill. So Dave then knew about the show, and he was interested in signing Madness, so he put them on the bill. So Madness, the first time he saw them live was opening the show. And Alan Cowderoy said, "Oh, we should have a house band. Let's have a house band because we all play things." So we're okay. Well, I played the guitar. Nigel played the guitar. Alan had been in a band called Gracious, who were a prog rock band, who apparently used to do gigs where the first song was called Heaven. That went on for 45 minutes. The second song was called Hell. That went on for another 40 minutes. And then the encore was 30 minutes long, and that was called Apocalypse. That was Gracious, signed to Phonogram, funnily enough, and he subsequently became a product manager there, which is how he met Dave Robinson, which is how Dave hired him to work at Stiff. So he was in a band, and then I knew the drummer who worked at Din Discs. He was a publisher, and I might have known, maybe he was at another label. Anyway, and then the other drummer was Rob from the Stiff Records Mobile, because we had a mobile studio by then. And then, rather selfishly, I made Nigel play bass, because nobody ever wants to be the bass player. And so I played the rhythm guitar. And then we had Liam Sternberg, the aforementioned Liam Sternberg, on guitar, Alan Cowderoy on guitar. And then we thought, well, we haven't got a singer, so we'll get Jock Scott. Now, Jock Scott who was a Scot and sadly passed away, was a very amusing character who was part of the sort of Ian Dury diaspora. He was a sort of a guy who was just around, who did sort of various odd jobs and helped out, and was very amusing. And we said, well, we'll get him to be the singer. So Alan decided we should do Chuck Berry songs. So we did 4 Chuck Berry songs, and then we did an extra "You Really Got Me," which Liam wanted to do, and that was it. That was we went on the stage. We did our set, which was punctuated by various members of the Rumour, and particularly Wreckless Eric, hurling abuse and drink at us. So no sense of camaraderie for their fellow musicians at all from them. They were absolutely unsupportive. Anyway, did the set. Thought nothing of it. When we came off stage, Ted Carroll from Chiswick Records, who we knew because he was on the scene, Chiswick Stiff. They had done a joint, the Stiff Chiswick Challenge as a sort of talent spotting night. They had got together, so everybody knew everybody in London in those days. He grabbed me and said, "Do you want to make a record?" Now, presumably, he thought he was going to get, a retro record because he'd put out various things. He was really into rockabilly, and he obviously thought Jock was a talented frontman or whatever, and he thought this was interesting. And us with our 2 drummers and 4 guitarists, we could probably make a racket. So I said, sure. Now, my friend Nick Garnett, who was the other drummer, whether he was at Virgin at the time, I think he must have moved to Virgin. Anyway, he was one of the drummers. He said, well, look, let's not do that. Let's trim the group down and let's write a song. Let's do it, because he was a music publisher, Well, okay. So we said to Nigel, we've got any songs? Because Nigel had also done a couple of songs at the end of the Be Stiff tour. We had a party at Kellogg's, the tour manager's place out in Essex. And Eric got up and did a few numbers, and Nigel also got up with his guitar and did a couple of numbers. Oh, he's a singer-songwriter. So he said, well, I've got this song here, which ended up being our single. It was a song called Tonight. And I said, well, there's too many songs called Tonight, so you've got to call it Maybe Tonight. And Nigel had the song, and then I wrote the middle eights, and I made them all. I made 3 different middle eights like Nick Lowe would have done. And then I ended up being the singer. I don't know how I became the singer. I just said, well, I'll do the singing. So we ended up as a trio. So me on guitar and singing, Nigel on bass, and Nick Garnett on drums. And we added Dean Clavat in the studio from Lena's band. And I got Phil Rambo to produce it, just so he could have his name on the label, because, you've got to have a name producer. He's a very nice chap. And we knew him because he was managed by Blackhill, who managed Ian Dury, and their office was 2 doors away. We were at 28 Alexander Street, and they were at 32 Alexander Street. So that was our single. So and Chiswick never heard it till we delivered it. We did that, and we did, on the B-side, we did It'll Be Me, which was the old Jerry Lee Lewis song, in the Richard and Linda Thompson arrangement, because they had done a version of it that I thought was good and rocking. So I said, let's do this. So then I went off I did the mix at Trident, I think. No, it was I did the mix at Riverside, where we recorded it in Chiswick, funnily enough, and I did the cut with Steve Angel at Trident. So delivered the lacquers and the tape to Chiswick, and that was the first time they heard it. And so that was our single. So it was only ever going to be on Chiswick. And then subsequently, when I'd moved to CBS, I managed to talk them into giving me some free studio time. So I did 4 songs that I'd written, one of which was our second single, You Tell Me Lies. And then after that, when I moved to Phonogram, I managed to get some more free studio time, because they had a studio in the basement. And they owned what became Solid Bond Studios, what was the Philips studio, where the Walker Brothers and Dusty Springfield made all their records. So I had loads of free studio time. And then I knew the people around the Townhouse studio and got some free mixing time out of them, which, as I say, is the only way you could make records, because it was just too expensive to pay for it. So every so often, if there was a Stiff compilation, I would say to whoever, do you want the Stiff All-Stars? No. No, thanks. They weren't on Stiff. Oh, all right then. And the reason we called ourselves the Stiff All-Stars and didn't have a picture on the sleeve is because it was an absolutely shameless attempt to sell some records to people who might be persuaded to think that it was Nick and Elvis or anyone or Eric or in disguise. So it was completely shameless on every level.
Did you ever get any feedback from anyone at Stiff Records?
Oh no, they didn't care. Dave has never commented, so he plainly thinks we're terrible. So, no, I mean, I'm trying to think. I think just if you could be bothered to make a record, I think people would go, "Oh, good on you."
Now, I have a two-part question for you. The first is, during your time at Stiff, 1978, 1979, were there any artists that you felt particularly passionate about that you think should have or could have made it bigger than they did? I know it's a tough question and totally subjective, but was there anyone you felt deserved more success? And then the second question, you're still involved in the music business today. What do you think the legacy of Stiff Records is? Do you still see the ripples from the splash that Stiff made when they entered the scene? Do you still see any sort of impact from the label when working in the music business today?
Well, yes, absolutely. The second half is easier to answer because I've thought about it long and hard, and you have to. It's quite hard. You have to take yourself back into an era when in the late 70s, cassettes didn't sell as well in the 70s as they did in the 80s. So they became the leading carrier in the 80s, unbelievably, because they were handy and you could take them to the beach or whatever. So LP was the thing. And as I said, in Britain, it was singles that did the business. So Stiff turned it on its head. By relentlessly pushing, first of all, Ian Dury, just from quality, just because they said, this is good music and you should listen to it and buy it. And I forgot to mention that New Boots and Panties, Ian Dury's first album, ended up going platinum while I was there. So I was involved in some of the sort of re-promotion of that and constant promotion, and we ended up pressing it on gold vinyl or whatever. Now, as I say, most records didn't hit gold, let alone platinum, 300,000 copies in Britain. So that not only paid bills, but it also gave Stiff the confidence to say, well, look, we should be a proper record company. Let's put out records that deserve to sell. And one of the things they did was they spent, and you could reasonably say overspent, on artwork. In terms of Chris Morton and Barney Bubbles, they were constantly coming up with things that were interesting in and of themselves. We did, one-sided promo singles, for instance, that I got criticized on the NME for. It's a terrible rip-off, said Julie Burchill. Well, that was just the promo copy, because we only want you to play the A-side. The commercial copy's got a B-side. Why not bother asking? Anyway, and we did things with die-cut holes. We did rumor singles in, emotional traffic in 3 different colors with die-cuts in the sleeve that you could see. Picture discs, cut-out discs. But you need to remember that in 1977, in the late 70s, and when I joined CBS in 1980, singles didn't come in picture sleeves. The punk labels in Britain in 76 stole the idea from the Dutch and the French, who always had picture sleeves, usually bloody awful, but at least a picture. And in Britain, nothing had a picture sleeve. You just got it on the radio and it sold because of the song, nothing to do with the packaging or the styling or whatever. And it took punk to come along to make the artist as important as the recording, if you see what I mean. It was the entity that was important. So therefore, the image was part of a whole enchilada. And Stiff was absolutely instrumental in pointing out to people that you're buying more than what's in the grooves. And they also spent far too much money on advertising in the press, the music press. But the adverts were witty and striking and well designed and interesting in a way that your major ads absolutely were not. And they would do in-store stuff, just for the sake of having presence. Their street postering. I mean, all the image for the Be Stiff tour, for instance, was, there were hundreds of badges, there were passes, there were slogans, there was a sampler album. All that kind of stuff rubbed off on the major labels who were starting to go. If you were a younger artist signed to a major label, you'd be going, oh, where's my badge? Well, why can't I have a picture sleeve? In fact, when I started at CBS, there was a band called The Hitmen that I was a product manager for, whose guitarist and drummer subsequently played with us, Mike Gaffey and Pete Glenister. And they were the songwriters of the band. And for the first 6 months, we were putting their singles out on a supposed indie label called, what was it called? instant records, or immediate records, or something like that, whatever it was called. Urgent records, that was what it was called, because it was uncool to be on a major label. So, the whole thing was that you were meant to be sort of in charge of your own destiny and not a serf to your major corporations. So Stiff had a huge amount to do with that. Now, not to take anything away from Radar, because Barney did all the art for Radar, and Nick and Elvis had fantastic graphics as well, and Dave Edmunds. But they were also they were established by then. They weren't coming out of the blue. And so that whole iconoclastic attitude, and the fact that you could, Ian Dury being the absolute example of someone who never would have been signed to a major label ever, and nobody would have allowed him to put out "Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick." It would have, oh, no, that's not going to get on the radio. That sort of thing, that you could break through musical genres just by doing something interesting, that's the sort of lasting legacy of Stiff, I would say. And in terms of the artists who should have done better, well, actually, I would say Mickey Jupp, funnily enough, because he was a fantastic songwriter. He was a little bit older than the other artists, not much older, but, enough for people to think, well, he's not 18. And his music is sort of timeless rock that has never been out of fashion. But you couldn't get him on the radio. You could get Rachel Sweet on the radio, albeit with a soul, soul cover. Wreckless Eric wanted to be on the radio quite a lot. But funnily enough with Eric, he took a step to the side. He wanted to be more rock than I ever felt he was. I don't know if you know what I mean. When Eric did Whole Wide World and Reconnaît Cherie, they're unique records. Nobody else would make a record like that. But then he started making records that were more like other people's. And he sort of felt that he should be better recognized as a rock artist in the vein of, I don't know who his heroes were, but let's say Dave Edmunds, as a classic rocker. And perhaps this is being a bit unfair to Eric, but he made less idiosyncratic records as he went on.
I agree. That first album by Eric still sounds like nothing else that's ever been released, arguably. And from there's still a lot of great songs on the second and third album, but that first one really is still special to this day.
Well, yeah, and I thought that was a shame on his behalf, because he was an interesting artist. And the same with Mickey Jupp, who carried on writing songs that were great for other people. Other people did, and he's a great singer, and but maybe we didn't know how to flog him, and he should never have had an album sleeve that had him called Japanese and him eating Chinese food. And that wasn't going to sell any copies to anybody. So I think but he was he wouldn't be told, Mickey, and I loved his set. I loved his band. I thought they were fantastically good. In particular, Pete Gosling on lead guitar, and the rhythm section was really solid. But you could possibly say that unless you made glossy records like Dave Edmunds, I love Dave Edmunds as well, but unless you make records like Girls Talk, you're possibly not going to get rhythmic rock on the radio, or stuff like Cruel to Be Kind, fantastic record, but a fantastically produced record, where Mickey didn't make those records with big harmonies and whatever. So that doesn't really answer your question, because I was there, for such a short period of time that I didn't develop the relationship that Nigel did with Madness. Although I knew Madness, I worked there single, and I've seen them, time since, and they were great blokes, really talented. But the thing is, they did get the success they deserved. And they were on the right label. Again, it's arguable if they'd been on a different label, they possibly would never have been indulged in the way that they were, or developed in the way that they were, with the creation of promo clips and videos and whatever. That's a whole other discussion, where really you need to speak to Nigel Dick about the growth of music video.
Well, between Guns N' Roses and Def Leppard and Oasis and Britney Spears, and the list goes on and on. Yeah,
absolutely. And I was instrumental in doing that, because what happens, he left Stiff and wasn't doing very much, and it was the development of promotional videos, promo clips, as we call them. And I basically went to the head of A&R, Chris Briggs, who I'd known. He was a big friend of Paul Conroy's, so I knew him through Stiff, and I got a job working at Phonogram, and it was the product managers who dished out the promo clips. They're the ones who commissioned them. And I said to Chris, look, this is really, I mean, I can do it. I can select people like Steve Barron. I gave him his Dire Straits job and, things like that. But I said, but really, we're too busy doing this. You need to spend all your time on it. And, Chrysalis has got a full-time commissioner for videos, and really, we should have one. And so Chris said, what you're really saying is that we need to create a job for Nigel Dick. I said, well, yeah. So they hired him. And he became the in-house commissioner, then the in-house producer, then the in-house director, and then he was able to go independent and move to LA and become the legend that he is today.
Well, Andy, I can't thank you enough. It's been great talking to you. Stiff has this cultural cachet that no other record label really has from that time, and to talk to somebody who was there, not quite at the beginning, but certainly right near the ground level has been fascinating. As such a huge fan of the label, it really seems like they still intrigue people and still have this, hold over people even 40 some odd years later.
Well, rightly so, I think. I mean, just the one story that I tell constantly is and I really, Dave Robinson now does a sort of lecture tour, which is very funny, where he tells lots of stories from his time as a roadie from Jimi Hendrix and as a photographer, his time mostly running Stiff and then getting into bed with Island, metaphorically speaking, et cetera, et cetera. To the extent that when I went to see him and he said, what do you think? And I said, actually, Dave, I think you're underselling yourself. I think you're not giving yourself enough credit for kicking ass, having ideas, making people do much more than they thought they could ever do, making things out of nothing, and having huge amounts of belief and never taking no for an answer. It was a really un-English attitude at the time. And the story I tell is what was interesting creatively is that I would see artists, who'd come in and they were, I don't like this mix. I don't like this photo. I'm going to speak to, and you'd see that across their face, they'd go, oh, I've spoken to Dave. He's told me that's the single. There isn't anyone else to speak to. There was no higher authority, which is very refreshing because, yes, you stand or fall by your decisions, but at least there's a decision. After that point, it became a committee of people, saying yes to the artist. And the more money the artist made or the more money you paid them, the more difficult it is to say no to them. Now, I'm not saying that artists should be told what to do necessarily, but at the same time, they shouldn't also be said yes to on everything, because nobody is right all the time. Nobody's an expert in every possible area. And sometimes, do you know the story about Madness's One Step Beyond?
I don't know.
Well, it was an instrumental. And Dave said to them, you did that instrumental, One Step Beyond, that's brilliant. You must, it's not a single, man. It's not a single. No, it's a single. You've got to record it. So they go, right, we'll show him. So they record it and they give him the tape. It's 1 minute and 30 seconds long. And they go, you'll never release that. So Dave goes into the studio, copies it and makes it 3 minutes long, releases it, and it's a top 10 hit. You'd never get away with that these days.
Stories like that show that, Jake, for the short time he was there, and Dave, for the longer time he was there, these guys really just kept punching up, kept fighting for artists they believed in, and, their integrity and their vision. It really shows when you look at the catalog of albums that they left behind.
I think so, yes. I think unbelievable. Now, I'm not saying I should have worked there another 5 years because I'd have been worn out. And also, you have to love what you're doing. So if I was never going to be anything other than the press person, well then, and in fact, I handed over to Nigel. Nigel became the press person after that, and got more awards than I did. I got a runner-up to the best press officer of the year, and he got the actual title the following year. So whether he was better at it than I was, I can't say. Other than he was good at it, certainly. But I've been far more involved in working with artists and and then of course, I subsequently worked with Paul Conroy again at Warner. I was the marketing manager, then the marketing director for Warner UK for 3 years in the late 80s, 86 to 89. So, yeah, end of 89. And I was far more involved in making those kind of decisions and, to some extent, because, with major labels, it's not all about your decision. It's about what can be done within the confines of what the artist wants to be done. But you're a little bit freer than you are in this case, being a press officer, where, as I say, you're kind of at the mercy of journalists in a way that I was a bit uncomfortable with, put it that way.
Andy, it's been a real pleasure speaking to you. Thank you again. To speak to somebody who was an employee of Stiff Records is a real treat, and I can't thank you enough.
Well, you're most kind. I feel as if I've been a bit waffly and haven't really scratched the surface. There's a lot more, but you can only do so much on a podcast, can't you?
Well, we've covered a lot, and I really appreciate it. This has been a really exciting opportunity. I can't say it enough to speak to somebody who was on the Stiff Records payroll, who was one of the brain trust behind so many wonderful revolutionary ideas for the label. This has been really exciting, and this is a nice segue into the next episode, where I'm going to be talking to Clive Gregson from Any Trouble, who Andy still manages to this day. So it was actually Clive who put me in touch with Andy, but the interviews are running in reverse order. But the fact that they're still working together all these years removed from Stiff Records, I think is really incredible. And again, this has been just such a joy to talk to Andy Murray, somebody who has so much insight into what it was like at Stiff Records, this label that we've all heard so much about and all imagined so much about. He was actually there. He was the boots on the ground, and just can't thank Andy enough for joining me. So, as always, thank you so much for listening. My name is Charles Epting. This is the Lost Labels Podcast. Until next time.